guess I'd like to start by asking if anyone has felt in the last, say, 6 months, just a twinge of anxiety from time to time, that some of the old nightmares of the 1980s were returning with bells and whistles and fire and fury. Yeah, and of course via Twitter. Do you want to stick your hand up if you felt from time to time just that little twinge of maybe the world might end next week or the week after and I wouldn't know what to do about it? Well, you've probably heard somewhat vaguely that the old nightmare of the 80s has somehow slithered back onto the agenda. And you've probably heard, sandwiched with the news of ICANN's Nobel Prize, that some obscure bunch of Nobel Prize winners in Chicago has recently said that the world is at 2 minutes to midnight. Whatever that means, it sounds pretty bad. Oh, and that midnight is indeed, in this context, the apocalypse. Now, perhaps I should footnote that by saying that it's not purely a nuclear apocalypse, that climate change comes into there, and in fact there are a whole range of apocalypses. And my favourite apocalypse is not actually nuclear. It involves experiments in artificial universe creation. And for sheer over-the-top theological hubris, that has to take the prize for absolutely everything. But I digress. We're talking about nukes. Now, you might remember, and this is a little bit of a trip down memory lane for some of us, that the last time the world was in this position, back in the 1980s, we had hundreds of thousands of people marching in the streets. Indeed, I'm sure that some of you were there. I have fond memories of the year 1983. It was in that year, on September the 26th, and then again in October and November, that the world nearly ended not once, but twice within a roughly 6-week period. But we didn't get to know about that until 15 years later. And the main thing that I remember about 1983 was that a certain rather wonderful somebody walked into my life, and she's been there ever since. But we were saved by a grumpy Soviet colonel who died last year, not so long ago, and by a couple of double agents who still rot in jail when they should have been given Nobel Peace Prizes. Yet the doomsday clock of the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists in 1983 was set at just 3 minutes to midnight. And it's now at 2 minutes to midnight. And that's as close as it has ever been. It has been at 2 minutes to midnight before, and that was in 1953, when the USSR and Russia the United States and Russia in quick succession tested their first ever thermonuclear bombs. And the United States vaporised the island of Aluga Lab and gave the crew of the Lucky Dragon radiation sickness. It was in 1953, it was also the year I was born, it was in 1953 that it really sank into the scientific community that humans now had the capability to wipe themselves out as a species, along with most other living things as well. In 1953, there was active talk of the United States taking out preemptive nuclear strikes against the USSR, a dynamic which is now being replayed with the DPRK. And not just because of Donald Trump, although Donald Trump obviously makes the situation a whole lot worse. There are, of course, some quite specific reasons that the clock has been moved since the relatively hopeful days, not so long ago, of 2009 and 2010. 2009 seems an eternity ago, but it was the time of the Prague speech on nuclear disarmament, a speech that won Obama a Nobel that even he could no longer wear with pride. Since then, however, things have gone backwards, faster and further than any of us could ever have imagined. In 2010, the New START Treaty was signed with Russia and the United States theoretically limited to 1,500, it's actually 1,550 operative warheads each, and limiting the number of launches to roughly 750. But the price that the United States Congress demanded for doing this was the most costly capital investment in nuclear weapons infrastructure ever made. It is an investment that Donald Trump has tried to take the credit for, but nonetheless it's an Obama investment. And it's an investment that says that the United States intends to remain with and rely on nuclear weapons. You don't spend $3 trillion on something just to throw it away. Well, perhaps you do, but that's another thing. But there is far worse to come. Toward the end of the Obama period, around 2014, there came a dramatic worsening in NATO-Russia relationships. And perhaps the best way to get an insight into that dramatic worsening is to do a simple Google, and Google inside the war room, and you will get the BBC worm's eye view of a war game which is played inside the Department of Defence, in which a group of exceedingly exalted people try to avoid World War III, and they progress through a World War I style escalation sequence into World War III. And it's absolutely chilling viewing, and I do recommend you all see it. It's very easy to get to, it's all on YouTube. Anyway, we have the dramatic worsening in NATO-Russia relationships, culminating in the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass insurrection that followed regime change in the Ukraine. At the same time, talk about possible nuclear war with Russia suddenly re-emerged with those BBC videos that I just mentioned. This particular fuse for World War III remains alight right now. But for now, it's been eclipsed by active talk of preemptive first strikes by the United States against the DPRK. So whilst we're seeing Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un's face on TV, and we're seeing all of those DPRK launches and so on, remember that there's this fuse burning in Eastern Europe and the Balkans that can actually launch 10 to 100 times as many warheads as could ever be launched by a US DPRK exchange, and that truly would be the end of the world. And this is what was talked about back in 2014. And it's still going, but we just don't talk about it anymore. To summarise, there are now actually a number of possible nuclear flashpoints. The one that everyone is most scarily aware of is, of course, the US DPRK flashpoint, made all more dramatic by the schoolboy rivalry between Little Boy Donald and Little Rocket Man. But there is at least one that is far more apocalyptically serious. That's the one I've just talked about. And then there is the United States South China Sea confrontation. It's my judgment that this is somewhat less likely to go nuclear than NATO-Russia. So really, NATO, Russia is right at the top of my list, and the Baltics, not the Balkans, though the Balkans are also volatile, is probably potentially the most dangerous place on Earth. Finally, there is the possibility of an India-Pakistan nuclear clash, which could possibly also involve China and the United States if enough things go wrong and if the White House is sufficiently stupid. Such a conflict, involving as many as 250 to 300 warheads, that's just if it's limited to India-Pakistan, of the size of tactical nukes, so rather than a 250 kiloton North Korean nuke or a 1 megaton Russian nuke, you've got a tactical nuke of 15 to 40 kilotons. It's roughly Hiroshima size. But India and Pakistan do have quite a lot of them. And that would give you a prompt body count. Notice the kind of language that's employed here. Prompt casualties. These are the people who get vaporised in the first 90 minutes. A prompt body count between 150 and 300 million Indians and Pakistanis, a lot of whom would be my friends because I go there quite often and I know a lot of people there. As opposed, you've got to get the right perspective here, as opposed to billions in a US, NATO, Russia, China conflagration. So keep the right perspective. 300 million, 150 to 300 million for an India-Pakistan confrontation, but for the big daddy of them all, sorry to use sexist language, but for the big one, with still the NATO, Russia, China one, you have a prompt body count. So it's the first 90 minutes or so, people getting instantaneously vaporised in the billions. So you're looking at a quarter to a third of the global population dying in roughly an hour and a half. The ensuing nuclear winter light from an India-Pakistan nuclear exchange would ruin global agriculture and cause the deaths of up to a further 2 billion over the next decade. That's according to a study done by Dr. Ira Helfand. A US-NATO-Russia clash, presumably involving China as well, involving, say, 3,150 kiloton to 500 kiloton warheads, would, first of all, extinguish high-tech civilization, which an India-Pakistan clash probably wouldn't. If India and Pakistan incinerate each other, probably they'll just, assuming no one else gets involved, probably they'll just incinerate each other. But the moment you start using very large warheads and the moment you start exploding them in space, then things like global telecommunications go down, the internet goes down, and the global financial system disappears. It's just not there anymore because all of those trades are done electronically and high-altitude nuclear explosions fry electronics. Now, apart from that, once the cities have stopped burning, which probably takes about a month or so, you would then have a number of decades in which temperatures were lower than those of the last ice age. Now, this makes major problems for being able to feed oneself. Agriculture would be very, very hard to sustain in that sort of situation. It makes major environmental problems as well because the jungles of the Amazon don't like being snap frozen. That could be a distinct problem. But in order to destroy contemporary electronic-based civilization and to cause the global financial system itself to literally disappear, as I foreshadowed, actually takes as few as 5 large warheads. And the Chinese DF-5 warhead is ideal, and at some stage I dimly recall a Chinese general saying that this is exactly what they'd use them for. The DF-5 warhead is a big monster warhead. It's a 5 megaton job. And if exploded in space 400 to 200 kilometres above the continental United States, would take that country instantaneously back to the 18th century. So every screen will go blank and all the lights will go out. Now, if that is done over a number of continental land masses, so if it's done over the United States, over Europe, and over Eurasia, then you're looking at the end of what we call civilization. You're looking at a situation where the lights go out, where the financial system, the internet, where every screen goes blank because the electronics have been fried. And recovery from that would be most extraordinarily difficult. And that's if no other nuclear weapons were ever exploded. So the nuclear weapons have this ability to cut through the delicate fabric that is contemporary civilization in a way that makes recovery near to impossible, that literally takes you back to the 18th century or to medieval times or whatever, the Dark Ages, whatever you want to compare it to. And bootstrapping yourself back is going to be next to impossible. It would be hundreds of years before civilization recovered. And darkness suddenly descends, and then it will be truly midnight.